Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
One of my favorite sayings is, let food be thy medicine. And when we think about food-based nutrients and all of the different roles that they play in terms of the modulation of metabolic pathways in the body, when we think about detoxification, there is one class of foods that really provides a unique spectrum of these bioactive compounds. And I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about cruciferous vegetables and the active components that are derived from this that do so much to support our health. So I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and let's get right to it. Let's talk some cruciferous vegetables today. I want to first define what a cruciferous vegetable is, because sometimes people hear that word and they're like, what? What is that? Well, we're talking about things like cabbage and cauliflower and broccoli, arugula, kale. We can look at turnip, rutabaga, for example, and they're all kind of fun to say, and they are very beneficial, of course, when prepared properly when it comes to the active chemical constituents that are contained within them. So, of course, if you're eating them as a whole food, that's a great thing because you're going to be getting the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber that are contained within them. But if we look at the extract of some of these bioactive components that are derived from the cruciferous vegetables, this is where things get really interesting. And we can look at indole 3-carbinol and DIM. And DIM is diindole methane. Now, indole 3-carbinol and DIM are both bioactive components. They're these natural metabolites that come from those cruciferous vegetables, and they have been studied extensively when it comes to how beneficial they are for the human body. So when we think about hormonal balance, when we think about targeting inflammation, the science behind indole 3-carbinol and DIM are impressive. And much of the early research was predominantly focused on cancer. And so in the setting of prostate cancer, breast cancer, endometrial cancers, now they have actually gone off into other areas, looking at liver health, looking at inflammation, things like rheumatoid arthritis, for example, and how beneficial the DIM and indole 3-carbinol can be. So when we're thinking about how it is that DIM and indole 3-carbinol are really working, we can look at them having antioxidant components to it. So obviously they're going to be fending off oxidative stress and free radicals, but we now recognize that they're actually working to deactivate certain inflammatory pathways, including NF-kappa beta and PPAR, for example. So a lot of these are linked with cancer in the way that cancer cells proliferate. So this is why it's really very interesting when you look at the science behind how these compounds that are naturally occurring in these vegetables, how much they're doing to really optimize our overall wellness. So I want to talk about a study that shows the phytochemicals and how they're working when it comes to the body's detoxification pathway. So we know that having a proper antioxidant response is certainly critical for our existence. And we think about metabolic detoxification, the different phases that occur. There's 3 different phases. And we know that in phase 1 and phase 2, there are certain antioxidants that are required, certain vitamins and minerals that are required. And when we look even at phase 3, there are different antioxidants that are required for the body to be able to properly detoxify. Now, here's where the interesting components come in, was to really analyze how it was that indole-3-carbinol and DIM were working throughout these 3 different phases of metabolic detoxification. So these powerful bioactive components that are derived from those cruciferous vegetables. And they found that the way that it was working was through the NRF2 or NRF2 activation. So that's a transcription factor. And they wanted to see if the indole-3-carbinol and DIM, if they were actually working via that pathway or if it was through a different pathway. And sure enough, they can see how those chemical constituents are actually helping with the activation of the phase 1, phase 2 detoxification pathways, which is really just a impressive feat when we think about it. This is why when I talk about things like glutathione and catalase and coenzyme Q10, vitamin C, vitamin E, all of our natural antioxidants, why they're so critical. But we can also now recognize that there are things that are coming from our foods, such as the cruciferous vegetables, and then when we take it in that extracted form, how much benefit we're getting for that detoxification process that occurs in the body. Now, I want to look at some of the science behind indole-3-carbinol and DIM and talk about why it is just so incredibly impressive. So in the beginning, a lot of the research, as I mentioned, very much heavy into the cancer of breast cancer, prostate cancers, endometrial cancers. There was a real interesting study that they did up at Strang Cancer Prevention Center in New York, looking at how indole-3-carbinol could be utilized for breast cancer prevention. And this was all the way back in 1997 and published in the Journal of Cell Biochemistry. And finding that when given the indole-3-carbinol, that the women had much more normal estrogen metabolites, and they were able to detect this through urinalysis, looking for the harmful estrogen metabolites versus the good estrogen metabolites. And they found that 300 milligrams per day was a promising amount to be utilized as a chemoprotective against breast cancer. So as I mentioned, all the way back in 1997. So we've known this for a very long time. Certainly, this was followed up with another study out of Rockefeller University through their Institute of Hormone Research, once again confirming that indole-3-carbinol did so much when it came to proper estrogen response and breakdown in the body. Now we can, fast forward and see how this was looked at in the setting of prostate cancers, and through the Karmanos Cancer Institute at Wayne State University in Detroit, they found that when targeting prostate cancer, that the indole-3-carbinol along with DIM did a really good job via the phase 1 and phase 2 enzymatic pathways. So once again, looking at that detoxification, understanding that having an increased capacity to detoxify actually led to an inhibition of the cancers from spreading. So just some very impressive research out there when we look at how indole-3-carbinol and DIM are working. And then, like I said, then they said, okay, well, hey, great, it's working that way. But if it's working for detoxification, it must be doing something if people had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or cirrhosis. So there was a study done back in 2016 where they were able to replicate that and show that indeed the indole-3-carbinol and DIM, that combination, was really beneficial in terms of impeding those pro-inflammatory cytokines that get driven up in settings such as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and cirrhosis. So when the liver itself becomes fibrotic, they found that the DIM and indole-3-carbinol was very targeted towards that. Now, I also mentioned in the setting of rheumatoid arthritis. So I just wanted to quickly mention that study, and this was in the Frontiers of Immunology, finding that the indole-3-carbinol and DIM, the DIM in particular, really had this great ability to inhibit the proliferation of TNF-alpha induced inflammatory cytokine production. And we know that in rheumatoid arthritis, it is the immune system that is doing all of that destruction. In this particular study, they were able to show this. They were able to see the way that the DIM and indole-3-carbinol actually could downregulate that pro-inflammatory cytokine assault that was occurring within the joint. And so to be able to prevent that inflammation and the joint destruction itself. And it's doing this through a couple of different pathways. But once again, they concluded that the DIM can have this therapeutic potential in the setting of rheumatoid arthritis. So there's so much when it comes to, let food be thy medicine. And I didn't want to let those cruciferous vegetables go by the wayside because there's so much when it comes to their benefits. They've even been able to show that the DIM has an ability to stop adipogenesis, which is absolutely fabulous because when we think about what adipogenesis is, that's the creation of new fat cells. So even in the setting of obesity, there are now studies that show that DIM from the cruciferous vegetables can suppress obesity through inhibiting the creation of new fat cells. And that was in the Molecular Nutrition Food Research Journal. So there's so many wonderful studies out there that continue to impress upon us that let food be thy medicine. There is truth to that. And make sure that you have lots of cruciferous vegetables on your plate. And when it comes to supplementation, start utilizing the indole-3-carbinol with DIM. So that is all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health. And we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.